Welcome back, friends, to Terrorverse TV. I'm John Altarello, your host, and today we're going to hit a new topic in our series of topics. I didn't want to get political, but unfortunately, so many things are happening out there that are so at the front of everyone's mind that I had to step in a little bit because people were pushing me to come forth with my own take on some of these things. Again, trying to be balanced. It may not seem balanced today because we're talking about Kamala Harris and her price fixing and some other policies that she's come up with that are a bit troubling to me and a lot of people in this country. So let's start with her. We're going to do a few clips out of her actual speech so that we can show you her actual words rather than have them filtered through the mainstream media. So let's start with her beginning of her speech.
I will focus on cutting needless bureaucracy and unnecessary regulatory red tape and encouraging innovative technologies while protecting consumers and creating a stable business environment with consistent and transparent rules of the road.
Okay.
As president, I will bring together labor with small businesses and major companies to invest in America, to create good jobs, achieve broad-based growth, and ensure that America continues to define the future and lead the world.
Okay. Now, if I didn't know she was a Democrat, I would have thought she was parroting the Republican platform for centuries. Lower regulation, growth, jobs. It's amazing that anyone from the Democratic Party could ever talk about lower regulation. That's all they do. It's all they've ever done. And it's pretty interesting that you would say that. But that's what politicians do. They're going to pander to the populace. She's clearly now moved from far, far left, which everyone knows she was far, far left. She's trying to move to the center, which is exactly what you're supposed to do. Any political scientist will tell you this. When you make she didn't have to go through the primary. When you're in the primary, you tend to go farther left because you're pandering to only your party. Excuse me. And clearly the Democratic Party has a very large progressive wing, so you had to pander to them first to get to be the presidential candidate. But then when you go to the general election, you move close to the center because you want to get those undecided voters or they're moderates. You want them on your side. So everyone does that. Now, Trump isn't, so that'd be interesting to see how that plays out for him. He's sticking to his lane. He's not really moving that far center. He may think he's already center. I don't know. But clearly, Kamala has definitely moved to the center, and she now has to disavow, and you'll see this, everyone's going to be pointing out all of her inconsistencies. Everything that she's saying now is, she said something before that's completely the opposite. So she's going to have a challenge convincing people when the political machines start to bang her every single day with her old words and trying to come up with her new ones. So let's go ahead and hit the next clip. That was just amazing to me. It sounded like the Republican platform. I was almost ready to vote for her.
My plans to build an opportunity economy, and today I will focus on one element that's on the minds of many Americans as they pay their bills at the kitchen table or walk the aisles of a grocery store, and that is lowering the cost of living.
Okay.
So every day across our nation, families talk about their...
So this is going to be one of her leading platform items because she's got to deal with this outrageous inflation we've had over the last 3.5 years. Now, it's very interesting. A lot of people are pointing this out, and it's fair to point it out. Her administration has had over 1,300 days to do something about the cost of living and hasn't done anything. So it's interesting that she's going to wait another 3 months to implement her policies when they should be implementing them today. The problem is the things that she's going to propose could never get passed anyway, and it's just a pandering to the populace. But let's get to some of her issues around the cost of food, for example.
When I am elected president, I will make it a top priority to bring down costs and increase economic security for all Americans. As president, I will take on the high costs that matter most to most Americans, like the cost of food.
Okay,
We all know
that's good enough.
that prices went
So the cost of food's a big one. Actually, you know what? Play a little more because I think there's something she says about the
up
increases.
during the pandemic when the supply chains shut down and failed. But our supply chains have now improved, and prices are still too high. A loaf of bread costs 50% more today than it did before the pandemic.
Okay, that's it. Stop right there. So a couple things there. First of all, the supply chain being shut down was government induced, so she ought to take some responsibility for that. And no one's ever apologized or sort of went back and analyzed whether that was a good move or bad move, because we know what it cost us. It cost us a lot. And then dumping so much money into the economy, and we'll get to Milton Friedman, one of my most favorite economists. We'll get to him later. We'll talk about what happens when you do that. That drove inflation through the roof. So throw money in there, cut off supply, prices are going to rise, and it's exactly what happened. And it's not because of price gouging. That's where she's going to go next. It has nothing to do with price gouging. Supply and demand is what determines pricing, not price gouging. Now, somebody may get away with it in a hurricane, right, where there's maybe no bottled water and that happens, and those they have laws to deal with. Price fixing, we have laws to deal with that too. We have the antitrust laws, which she is in charge of, the FTC and the Attorney General, which both have the right to prosecute these things. So, former AG, if you think there's price fixing going on out there, why aren't you bringing the cases now? Why are you waiting till you get elected? And the last thing, this is really the one that really irks me the most. She just said that prices went up 50%. Now, if you watch my earlier segment where I talked about the New York Times fact-checking Trump speech, he said 50%, and they said it was a lie. It's funny, right? It's really funny how the New York Times will call that a lie when Trump says it, and no one says boo when she says it. And the bottom line is, I think it has gone up 50%. So the truth is, it is 50%. If she's saying it, she wouldn't be saying it if she was trying to also attack the fact that Trump said it. Let's go to the next one.
And I will work to pass the first ever federal ban on price gauging on food.
All right, stop right there. So, price gouging, just so you get it right, Kamala. It's not gauging, but in any event, the first federal law, won't that be a shocker? That'll be a disaster. Now we will become the Soviet Union. And you'll see what happens when you fix prices. You'll see what happens when you try to control supply and demand. And we'll have shelves empty. And this has been happening anywhere in the world where the government controls the means of production, and they decide prices and they decide supply. And because the demand is the demand. People decide the demand, not the government. And that's why you can't do that. That's why we have markets. That's why we have the best economy in the world. That's why you can go to the supermarket and buy anything you want from the whole entire world. We have the best available everything in America. There is no other country you can get everything here. Even if you go to Europe, they sometimes can't get some of the things that we have here because they have tariffs and all these other things that prevent us from shipping goods to them because they want to protect their home turf. And we'll get to that later maybe because Trump sometimes is in favor of tariffs. I am not. Free market guys don't like tariffs. Now, you do sometimes have to have tariffs as punitive measures to stop other countries who are doing other things like dumping and also have tariffs. I get that. But in general, they're bad. They hurt prices and they hurt everybody. Now, yes, of course, if they're able to produce better in another country at a lower price, we ought to be able to buy that stuff in America. It lowers our overall cost. And we shouldn't protect industries here just because they're American. They need to compete. When the auto industry couldn't compete against Japan and we did a lot of the tariffs, it did not help us. They went out of business anyway. Now, guess what? They compete. They got better. They got more efficient. Now, the problem was they couldn't deal with the unions. I get it. And that is a problem. When you start to have unions to the point where they put a company out of business, labor is an issue. We do sort of need labor unions, I think, at some level. but I think they're also sort of anachronistic. The only place that they really reside, except in a couple of industries, is what? The government. And who is the most inefficient provider of anything in the world? The government. Because you can't fire people. And academia, because they all have tenure. So the worst run places are places where you don't have actual market forces on labor, capital, and supply and demand for goods and services. Competition is what makes it happen. Let's go to the next one. She's going to talk about competition next, and that's going to be interesting to see what she says about that.
We will help the food industry become more competitive because I believe competition is the lifeblood of our economy. More competition means lower prices for you and your families.
All right. Absolutely, totally agree. How do you do that when you decide to fix prices? Okay, it doesn't work that way. And it just shows that she has zero understanding of economics at all. Not surprising, but competition is what sets us apart. That's what does it. And by the way, if she doesn't think that we have enough competition, and boy, we have a lot of competition in the food industry, and people like to attack it. But look how many different stores there are. Look how many different producers there are, and they come to the market every day. Think about how many different waters, just water. Okay, the most basic substance in the world. How many different brands of water are out there? Are you telling me there's no competition? Please, you're just actually being naive, and it's just disrespectful to the average person who knows better than that. And that's that. I mean, yes, there are large corporations that control a lot of the shelf space in the supermarkets. Of course there are, but there's a ton of small companies that control shelf space, and it can also be used as competition for the big guys. And at the end of the day, competition is what drives the prices down, and we love that. And if there's monopolies out there, and by the way, price fixing in and of itself is monopoly. It's just being done by the government. If you allow the companies to set their prices, they're going to set them. And then again, they're going to drive out, the bigger players will drive out the small players. They can't handle that kind of margin erosion. I mean, anyone that knows anything about business or economics knows you don't do that. You're going to kill the small guys, not the big guys. The big guys can survive it, and they will. Okay, and then the small guys are done. So if you want to take care of small business, the last thing you want to do is fix prices. Let's go to the next one.
For just a minute, answer a question without the benefit of an auto cue, and it did not go well. Here she is asked about how she plans to pay for these policies she's announcing. See if you can work out the phrase her advisors have clearly drilled into her head.
In terms of the tax credits, we know that there's a great return on investment. And when we increase home ownership in America, what that means in terms of increasing the tax base, not to mention property tax base, what that does to fund schools, again, return on investment. I think it's a mistake for any person who talks about public policy to not critically evaluate how you measure the return on investment.
Return on investment. In the full clip, she said it 4 times in about 40 seconds.
Right.
It's like a kid cramming for an exam. Just keep.
So I'm going to hit this a couple of ways because it's important. Actually, return on investment is a great way to measure if you could actually measure it. Let me give you another example of horrible return on investment. And this will strike home for everyone. Government subsidized education, where student loans, right, they're all subsidized by the government, has driven up the price of education astronomically, okay? Astronomically. These schools would not charge the prices they charge if they couldn't get the government to subsidize that additional tuition with these loans, which now the government wants to forgive because they realize, hey, we burden these students with this ridiculous amount of debt, so and that they can't afford to pay. And by the way, we also subsidize people taking on college degrees that have zero chance of getting a job, right? So when you give away free money or money that now maybe, or cheap money, right? It was low interest rate money. People made bad decisions about how they were going to invest it. They didn't see what was going to happen. Now that they have to pay the debt, they're really, oh boy, I wish I'd got a degree in maybe biology or engineering because maybe I can get a job instead of, some of the other degrees that have no chance of getting a job. That's just bad, okay? So your ROI on government investment in education is abysmal. And these other ROI on these other things is going to be just as devastating because you're going to disrupt the market forces. You're going to incentivize people to go in the wrong direction. And we've had this problem in the housing market forever. The last housing bust, okay, was caused by the government. Why? Because Fannie, Freddie, and all these sort of government, quasi-government agencies that were giving out cheap money to underqualified borrowers. In fact, they were giving out more than 100% of the loan value. They lowered the standards ridiculously, and the banks, who had no choice because they had to compete with the government, by the way, they originate the loans for the government. They don't keep the loans on their balance sheet. They went along with those things. And of course, they pumped a ton of money in, ran the prices of housing up, massive bust, 10 years to clean that up, and we're back into the same old game again. We never learn. We never learn. Keep giving out cheap money and let people make bad decisions with that because they don't have the recourse, and this is what's going to happen. It's happened over and over again. You can't keep doing this, and people think it's good for them. Anyone that gives you that, it's just they don't care about you. They clearly don't care about it. It's not affecting them. It's going to get them elected. They don't care about you. They don't care about the long-term effects on your family, your kids, and I do. And I don't want my kids growing up in a situation where they can't get a house. And by the way, I just had this conversation with my son. You know, he just finished college, and I let him do whatever he wanted to do, and now he's sort of figuring out what he wants to do, and he's realizing that maybe the job that he was picking is sort of not going to be a great job and not going to make enough money. And I said, look, you know, you do what you want to do, but you're going to have to get a graduate degree now or a job. Take your pick. But you're going to have to figure out which one is going to make the best for you, and you're going to have to come up with one that is going to pay your way because I'm not going to be here forever. You know, and he it hit home. He was a little depressed for a couple of days, but then he started doing his research, and he's realizing that, wow, I got to pay attention. Some of these jobs, you know, pay $20,000, $30,000 a year. I went to college for what? You know, I said, guess what? You better pay attention because not all jobs are the same. And if you want to get a job that pays better, you might have to do a little something more in your educational background, and you may have to do a little bit more work in terms of getting experience. And it was a shocker to him, and they don't teach you that in college. No one told him any of that stuff. They just keep encouraging him to take the classes that were worthless because those teachers can't get a job unless they have these worthless classes, and that's what happens. So my son had a real awakening. He had a couple of days of depression. He got over it. He's doing the work, and I'm proud of him. And I wanted him to do it on his own. He's young enough. He can survive. You know, he's 22 years old. He can make a few mistakes before he has to really start to worry about it. And I wanted him to do it on his own. I didn't want to be the kind of parent that says, you've got to do this, that, or the other. I wanted him to figure it out because I'm not going to be here forever. And he's going to have to figure it out on his own, just like I did. All right, let's go to my favorite economist. Now, this is an interesting clip. People that don't know about Milton Friedman, they're missing out on one of the greatest minds ever. Along with Thomas Sowell, you ought to look them up. These are people you should read. I was not taught. I was an economics, and finance major in college, and they did not talk about Milton Friedman. Maybe it was a footnote in the book. It was all John Maynard Keynes. Keynesianism was all that was taught, and that's probably even worse now in most universities. And Keynesianism is a sort of the democratic sort of way of doing business. It's a tax and spend. His whole model is the only way to promote growth is for government spending and high taxes, and it's all been proven a million times to be wrong. And guys like Milton Friedman, who's a free market guy, very bright, very articulate, and very common sense. You can talk to anyone and explain it to him. He's got a book called Freedom to Choose. When I read that, when I was in college and I was taking economics and I was looking at all this Maynard Keynes, I was doing all the graphs, I was doing all the math, and I sort of believed it because that's all you were taught. I read Freedom to Choose, and it talks about how a pencil, this is the funniest thing ever. You should read this, it's great. How a pencil comes to be. How many different pieces go into a pencil, a lead pencil, and how in the world, and all over the world, because the rubber comes from one place, the wood comes from another place, the lead comes from another place, the brass ferrule around the top comes from another. All of that has to be produced, right? And it has to come in the right amount. And by the way, a pencil's like a penny, they're almost nothing. And yet, you can still go, people still use those lead pencils. They still sell them, right? You would think with all this stuff that's changed in the world, you can still go to a store today. You can go to any store, any convenience store, any supermarket, and you will find a bunch of lead pencils, and there's always enough around, and there's never too much. Just right. How does that happen? Without any of those countries, any of those producers collaborating, no government picking out how many pencils. Now, The same thing if you go to Russia, and I don't know how bad it is now, but there was a time when you couldn't get certain size shoes because the government would say how many size 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. They didn't care how many people were. They extrapolated. Some government economist was trying to figure it out. You go in America, you can find any shoe you want, any size you want, anywhere, anyhow, in a million different styles. Okay? Go to Russia and try to get that. They come here to get their stuff. People from all over the world come here to get their stuff. Why? Because they can't get it there. Because when their government decides how much to produce, you're not going to get the right amount. The markets dictate. If you make too much rubber for the pencils, you're not going to sell it. The cost is going to go down. You're going to lose money. So guess what? The market will determine how much you need to produce. And that works very well. And Milton Friedman is the greatest proponent of the markets. He's a great guy. And Freedom to Choose is a great book. You should get it. But let's watch a couple of clips from Milton. You should learn a few things from him.
Inflation is made in Washington because only Washington can create money. And any other attribution to other groups of inflation is wrong. Consumers don't produce it. Producers don't produce it. The trade unions don't produce it. Foreign sheiks don't produce it. Oil imports don't produce it. What produces it is too much government spending and too much government creation of money and nothing else.
That's inflation. And he's dead right. And I've talked about this before. There's two types of policy. One is monetary policy, and that's where, the Fed puts money into the system. And then there's a fiscal policy where the government controls spending and taxes. Okay, so they both have a trigger on inflation. And when we put too much money in, which is what we did during the COVID situation, the COVID crisis, and then since then, the government has not stopped spending. They just have not. It's just one spending program after another. And that has exacerbated it. That's where you get inflation. It's not price gauging or / gouging. It's from government overspending and putting too much money into the economy, and also the Fed policy of also increasing the money supply, and that was the mistake that they made. But again, I think a lot of that was from political pressure. Let's go now to the next one, government spending.
As I said before, keep your eye on one thing and one thing only, how much government is spending, because that's the true tax. Every budget is balanced. There is no such thing as an unbalanced federal budget. You're paying for it. If you're not paying for it through it in the form of explicit taxes, you're paying for it indirectly in the form of inflation or in the form of borrowing. The thing you should keep your eye on is what government spends. And the real problem is to hold down government spending as a fraction of our income. And if you do that, you can stop worrying about the debt. As I said...
Okay, so there's nothing more important. It's probably one of the most important things. And that's why as a free market sort of conservative on economic policy, we know that the biggest problem is government spending. It's out of control. It's been out of control for a long time. I can't blame one side or the other. They're both part of it. But that is our problem. And as a society, we should ask for less government spending. Now, I'm not talking about cutting essential programs. What I'm talking about is the waste. And there's so much of it, it's embarrassing, okay? And if you keep doing this, you're burdening the next generation with $35 trillion of debt that it has to be paid for. So part of our taxes every year, a very big portion of it just goes to pay interest on the debt. It's like carrying a credit card that's way beyond your income. We should not be spending more than we earn. And that is a mistake. And then to say, well, raise taxes. How much more can you raise them? It is already ridiculous how much taxation we have. We're getting to the point where you're going to just reduce productivity because at some point people won't pay it. They'll leave, they'll cheat, they'll find ways not to pay their taxes. And that has been the case throughout history. When you have ridiculously high marginal rates, people aren't going to pay it. So they find loopholes and it's just not right. Let's get the rates down. Let's cut the loopholes out. Let's people pay a fair share. People that make more are going to pay more. No one has an issue with that. But the spending's got to come under control. And all you're hearing from the candidates on the Democratic side is more spending, more this, more that. How many more? And by the way, if you look at the number of programs that they come up with, there's already 20 of the same things in existence. There's no new anything. You're just piling more onto the same old, same old, same old. How many more infrastructure plans are we going to have and still have the worst highways in the world? Okay, it's just baloney. I'm so sick of hearing the infrastructure plans. Every time I hear that, I know, oh my God, there's another pork, belly plan that's going to be out there. Where there's going to be a ton of pork. Everyone's going to get money for their home state so they can get elected again. But none of that's going to go to the highways. The highways just get worse and worse and worse. Bridges fall down. It's just terrible. Our electrical infrastructure is at risk. Everything that we have is at risk because we spend too much time and money on wasteful things. So let's go to the next clip, which is socialism. And this is one that people better really pay attention to. This has been coming for a long time. Milton Friedman's spot on. He's been tracking this for his entire career. Let's talk about that next.
Even earlier, intellectual opinion had been shifting towards socialism.
Are we at the beginning, Jen?
In
Yeah, okay, that's fine. Go ahead, sorry.
Britain, with the Fabian Society in the United States, people don't realize that every economic platform, every economic plank of the Socialist Party platform of 1928 is now part of law. So, intellectual opinion was shifting towards socialism. Public opinion was not of that thing. The Great Depression had the major effect it did because it made people, public opinion, accept that intellectual opinion and say, oh, we had a Great Depression because the private enterprise system failed on us, and we need to call government to our aid, and these intellectuals who were talking about having government play a larger role were really right. And so, policy started to shift toward bigger and bigger government and more centralized government. But as it did so, people started getting disillusioned, and particularly small groups of intellectuals around the world started getting disillusioned. And intellectual opinion started to shift the other way. Let me give you a dramatic example. Ronald Reagan was preaching the same thing in 1964 when he spoke on behalf of Goldwater as he was preaching when he was elected president in 1980. He could not have been elected on that platform in 1964. He is the only president in my lifetime who was elected not because he was saying what the people wanted to hear, but because the people had come around to wanting to hear what he was saying. He hadn't changed his opinions, but the public at large was getting fed up with what? With higher and higher taxes. With what? With inflation produced by government. With what? Increasing rules and regulations and governmental bureaucratic controls. So public opinion was beginning to share what had been happening in intellectual opinion. And once public opinion starts moving in that direction, with a lag of a decade or two, policy will follow. And that's why I was very optimistic that there was going to be a greater role for markets. More optimistic than was justified. We haven't achieved as much as I would have anticipated or expected. We have moved somewhat in that direction, but the greatest successes in that area have not come in the West. And indeed, well, I'll come back to that, but they've come in the East, obviously. The fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of communism in Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary is the most hopeful thing for human life, human policy, that has happened in my lifetime. It carries with it, however, problems for the United States. On the whole, I think it's been a bad thing for the United States because it's introduced complacency in the United States. We've been inclined to say, look at this. These people, our system has been working and theirs hasn't. And therefore what we've been doing, everything we've been doing must be right. I summarize this in the form of 3 propositions that are widely believed. Number 1, socialism is a failure. Everybody believes that now. Number 2, capitalism has been a success in enabling people to have a higher level of income and a higher degree of freedom. Everybody believes that. Proposition number 3. Therefore, the United States needs more socialism. Hard to render that consistent with the first 2 propositions, and yet it's what people believe. You don't hear talk in Washington about having more capitalism. You hear talk in Washington about how we need to have more government spending on schools. We need to have a stricter enforcement of drug prohibition. We need to have child care methods. We need to have the government pass Clean Air Acts. But if they were really taking the lessons of what's happened in Eastern Europe, they would be saying, or the people would be requiring their representatives in Washington to say, we should abolish Amtrak, we should get rid of farm subsidies, we should eliminate tariffs, we should cut the government down to size. But that's not what anybody is saying, although that's the lesson that is taught. Problems in the United States are exactly the same as the problems with the Soviet Union, with Poland and the others. The difference is that they were 100% socialist and we're only 50% socialist. But just as their 100% socialism produced problems that was beyond belief, every major problem in the United States, in my opinion, is coming from the 50% of our society that's socialist.
I got to tell you, everyone has to listen to this. They really do. Milton has hit it on the head. He has explained how we went from socialism to capitalism to half socialism, where the academic influence has been, and how governments here, and the policies and the politicians, are attacking the one thing. And it's a good thing we still have 50% capitalism. Can you imagine if we go to 80% socialism? We'll be right like Russia. Milton's got it right. And he was optimistic, and I used to be optimistic. I could not have predicted this turn of events where we're actually having this debate in 2024. I can't. Given how well we've survived our 50% socialism for the last 50, 60 years. And the fact that we've come full circle on this, and a whole generation or two or three has no concept of where we've come from, doesn't have any basis in understanding the economics here, is lost. And they're buying into this theory or this socialism idealism, which is going to be the destruction of everything. And it has happened around the world, and it can happen here. We're not going to be immune to it. We've only been around 250 or so years, and and we may have one of the shortest runs as a power, as the preeminent power in the world of any historical cycle, but it's going to happen from our own, eating ourselves from within, and that is tragic. So I wish people would pay attention to Milton, and I'm going to do a couple little more things here before we wrap up. But that he could not have said it better. I wish people would read more of him. I wish they would talk about Thomas Sowell, read his stuff. He's great on all of the sort of Great Society programs, which we're going to have a whole series on, and he'll be a big part of that because he can explain what happened to America, why, after the trillions upon trillions of dollars we've spent to make people better off, they're not better off, and why. So let's cover a couple more of these posts. I think they're interesting to see what's going on in Venezuela, for example, and a couple other things. All right, so this is Argentina. They have their new president there, Javier Milei. He's just turned that country around in no time at all. He's cut government down to size. He's changed them from a socialist economy to free market as best he can, and by by getting rid of rent controls, look at this, housing skyrocketed by almost 200%, and the prices have plummeted. Whereas Harris wants to go the other way. It's going to be the same thing. Rent controls don't work. Everyone knows that. And by the way, when you put them in place, like New York City's had rent controls for decades, has not increased low-income housing at all. All it's done is has people who have those rent control apartments pass them on from generation to generation, who are getting a free ride off of the taxpayer because they were able to get these rent control apartments. It's a disaster. You ought to go try to look into it. No one cares. No one cares at all. Those people that have those rent control apartments are not low-income people for the most part. They're people who have gotten them through illegitimate means, and they're keeping them forever. Okay, and most of the low-income housing is coming from free market builders, okay, who build. Now, New York City is not an easy place to build multifamily housing. It's just not. The cost is very high. So does that mean the government's going to come in and dictate that? What happens when they do that? They create slums. They create areas where people don't feel safe. Okay, the government cannot do that. There are some places that are just going to be too expensive for people to live. That's okay. You can move a little farther out. My entire life, I never lived in the most expensive area. I always lived outside of it because it was more effective. I wanted to have more house, and therefore I lived farther away, and I had to commute. Yeah, tough, okay? Big deal. And you know what? Everyone's so concerned about having to have everything, their cake and eat it too. That's baloney. You know, the rest of the world doesn't do that. The rest of the country doesn't do that. And if you don't want to live in New York or you can't afford to live in New York, don't live in New York. It's not a requirement. You know, you're not entitled to live here if you can't, live here. And by the way, there's a ton of people that live all in the boroughs, and they're doing just fine. And New York City works just great. And the only reason why people complain about it is because the government uses that to grab the votes of people, and that's a sad way to go. And it's not helping the people at all. And let's go ahead and warehouse them again like they've been doing throughout history and see what happens there. Let's do a couple more, Jen, before I get a little bit more on my rant. We'll cover all these social programs in another series. Let's talk about these other two little links that you see on there. I saw a couple of cute ones on, I think it was Twitter or LinkedIn.
So that we will take over. And yes, we can do that. Yes.
All right. So
yes, we can do that.
So,
yes, we can do that.
So
It's the question is, do you have the will to do it? I have the will to do it.
all right.
I will snatch.
Let's stop
their
that.
cabinet.
Wow. If that doesn't scare you, so our presidential candidate here, our vice president, is willing to take your property. Does that sound like America? You had a patent issued by the patent office after going through a grueling process to prove that you had an invention that was unique and that it was yours and you have the right to protect that intellectual property. And if the government doesn't like it, so Elon Musk, we don't like your Tesla, we're going to come in there and we're going to snatch your patents and we're going to take over your car company. And then if we don't like, a drug patent, we're going to snatch those too. Wow. And she said that out loud and she laughed about it. Think about it, folks. Think about it. That is a very, very frightening thing for someone running for president to be saying. And if you are not terrified about that, then you are missing everything. Let's go to the next one. This is a post by someone on X, okay, which does a great job of going through what happens when you do price fixing. And we'll put a link to this, but you scroll down a little bit, Jen, it just goes to show what happens to like grocery stores and shelf space and the margins. And it just goes to show, he goes through it very, very detailed in a way you can understand it. And he does a great job of explaining what's going to happen. And let's go to the bottom line because, the bottom line is what's going to happen is you're going to have food shortages. The places that are going to have the most food shortages are the low-income neighborhoods where they're already claiming that they have what they call food deserts or whatever, something like that, because they don't have the same amount of food on their shelf because of the fact that the supply chains don't go there because of a bunch of different reasons. This is where we're going. And at the end of the day, if you try this, it will fail. Absolutely. And there's plenty of examples around the world of where that's going to fail. So if you want to help poor people, the last thing you want to do is price fixing. And the fact that she doesn't know that makes her, in my mind, unqualified to lead the country because you cannot have these policies. And I haven't heard these from Democrats other than Bernie for a long time. Most Democrats avoid these types of, these socialist agendas because it doesn't work. But I guess maybe maybe like Milton said, maybe the public sentiment has turned around to the point that's what they want to hear. And a lot of things when I think about what he said, what Milton said is that I think when Trump came up, the reason why he was successful in running on the platform he ran was because people wanted that. They wanted lower taxes. They wanted less government intrusion. They wanted more freedom. And Trump was saying that, so he got elected. I think, and she may be right, and she gets elected, then she's going to say, hey, public sentiment shift the other way. They want more socialism. I get it. If that's what people want, they're going to get it. And then they're going to see what happens. And I'm going to tell you right now, I'm glad I'm not going to be around long enough to sort of see all of that because it will be tragic, and I worry for my kids and my grandkids. Let's go to the last one. I think this is another price fixing. Maybe that was the last one. Was that the last one? Yeah, maybe that was the last one. Sorry, Jen. I misspoke because we had both the patents and that was the price fixing. Yeah. So I think we've covered the waterfront. There's plenty more. I could do 10 hours on this alone. I could analyze every bit of this, and I could bring in all kinds of stuff from economics and a bunch of other experts. But frankly, if you don't believe and you're already bought into this this dogma, there's nothing I can do to change your mind, I'm pretty sure. What I'm hoping is that someone that hasn't made up their mind, who isn't religiously affiliated with one side or the other, will pay attention. And I'm telling you from my own experience, I've been around long enough, I've seen enough of this, I've done a lot of research, my own life is my own experience. I can tell you, I'm lucky that the markets exist. I'm lucky that competitions exist. I am able to compete against big players because of the way we run our system. And thank goodness for that. You don't have to be big to compete. You just have to be good. And you have to work hard. And if you do that, you can succeed in America. It absolutely is true. And there's a zillion examples of it. And people don't want to admit that. They always want to say that's the one-off. They had some kind of advantages. You hear about equity now. The argument about equity is, well, everyone doesn't start at the same place. Yeah, no kidding. Some of us start behind the starting line. Some of us are at the 10-yard line. Some are at the 50-yard line. That's reality, no doubt about it. But at least in America, it's a 100-yard race. It's not 110, 120, 130. And if you can catch up, like most of us that started off sort of behind the line, and if you work harder and you train harder and you get a little faster, you can make up that ground. But it's not going to guarantee that the outcome is going to be the same. It's just not. So trying to say that, we're going to have to advantage people, we're going to have to figure out how to get you to the same starting point, because that's what they're saying. They're not saying let's everyone be able to run the race, which is all I ever wanted. I want the ability to run the race. I don't need an extra help. I don't need to handicap the other person. I just want the ability to run the race. That was what we were a problem before. People were not allowed to be in the game. Now you're allowed to be in the game, but we say, oh, we're going to have to handicap it because, you're not as good as that guy or that. Who decides that? Who decides that? At least in golf, you can play enough rounds, you can get a handicap, okay? But there's no handicap at the pro level, right? You play heads up, period. You want to compete for the real money. The guys that get the handicaps were playing in Saturday and Sunday afternoon matches. Who cares? Okay, it's just a game. But it's not the same. When you compete for the real stuff, there isn't a handicap. They don't have a handicap at the Olympics for the 100-yard dash. Okay, they don't. You have to compete. And everyone gets to train. And not everyone has the same body structure, the same height, the same whatever. They come from all over different countries. Do you think every single Olympic athlete is the same starting point? I mean, it's just absurd to even say these things. It's not fair. It doesn't make sense. Yes, people who are disadvantaged, we do need to do some things to help them. If there's barriers in their way, we should remove the barriers. And I'm even okay with some of the programs where you kind of give people a boost up that have been historically disadvantaged. I don't have a problem with that. As long as it doesn't get out of control where people are suffering for decades, if not generations, under the same old government policies that do not allow people to grow, develop, and become more productive. Because everyone has to produce. Whoever's not producing is getting subsidized by people who do produce. I don't know how people don't get that. They think the government money just comes. No, it comes from other people's effort. You want to go back to when everybody growing their own food, hunting their own animals for food if they want, or if they don't grow it. They want to make their own clothes. They want to build their own shelters. They want to do all that on their own. Yeah, go for it. But the way it works, so it's efficient, is that we all do something, contribute, and that contribution is paid for in cash so that we can trade that cash for somebody else's production. And when people don't produce, that means everyone else is contributing to their existence. And the only people that should get that are people who are unable, physically, mentally, they're ill, or there's some other reason why there's no way they can produce anything. And frankly, we have way too many people who have ability to produce something. They just don't want to, or the government has made it so easy that they don't have to, or actually enslave them by putting them in programs that they can't produce, because if they produce, they get taken off of their subsidies. That is not right. And we'll get into that in another section. I've gone off on this enough. If you think that socialism is the way to go, you know who to vote for. And if you think that it's not the way to go, you probably know who to vote for as well. It's a long session. I'm sorry I got off the topic a little bit, but at the end of the day, I thought it was so important. When I heard her policy, I didn't expect that to come out of the box. I thought she would do a different thing. I thought that might be behind the scenes because we know how far left she is. But to actually come out and say it in her first statement, it was shocking to me, which tells me what the left believes about the sentiment of our country, that people actually are going to believe this stuff. And I'm terrified if that's the case. And if that is the way it goes, hey, I live here, I'll have to live with it, but that's fine. But it's tragic. So thank you very much for listening. God bless. Hit the like, subscribe, bell, comment, tell me how crazy and nuts I am and how weird I am. I'm okay with all that. But, be somewhat civil. And we'll try to respond back. If you got other topics you want me to hit, I'll hit them. And it's been great having this conversation with you. I hope you enjoyed it. See you on the next Terrorverse TV. Signing off now. God bless.